When the rich kid struggled, the employee's hidden gift changed everything. The sentence could have been a headline or a whispered rumor at a school corridor, but it began quietly, in a library that smelled of lemon polish and old paper, where marble columns held up air that never learned to breathe. The house gleamed like something carved out of light. Chandeliers hung like constellations over rugs the size of small cemeteries. Portraits lined the hallways, stern faces in gilt frames, ancestors who stared at the present as if it were a misfortune of weather. Outside, the garden cut a perfect hymn against the city, ordered hedges, fountains that rehearsed the same note all day. Inside, the boy sat cross-legged on the floor, crayons scattered like tiny confessionals. Nicolás del Soler had a name that opened doors. It bought winter vacations, private tutors, the best uniforms the academy could tailor. It also weighed on him like a shadow that learned to follow his hand. He could move through rooms like a boy at a masquerade, smiling when required, silent when expected. Yet at school, his papers arrived like failed importations of himself. Assentive signatures from teachers, polite notes left in his bag, sentences that said with all the care of a formal letter that he did not meet expectations. He loved to draw. That was where he felt a kind of authority. In his drawings, numbers were birds that landed on branches labeled 1 to 10. History unfolded as scenes in which tiny cardboard soldiers enacted treaties and betrayals. A chemical reaction appeared as a pattern of colored marbles knocking into each other. If he closed his eyes and held one of those pages against his chest, a quiet certainty filled him. If the world could be rearranged into pictures, he could find his way through it. Teresa Morales found the drawings on a rainy Tuesday. She had been in the Del Soler house long enough to know its rhythms, the clink of the footman's tray at breakfast, the hush that announced Don Esteban's reading hours, the soft, practiced patience of Señora Dolores, the head housekeeper, whose one unshakable belief was that domestic order kept catastrophe at bay. Teresa moved through that rhythm with a different sound, a steady footfall that had once taught children under the open sky, under a roof that leaked in the rainy season, where the blackboard was a slab of wood and the playground was a field of stones and stars. She had been a teacher before the house found her, and a teacher remains, even when the classroom changes its address. The smell of pencil shavings and the angle at which a child held a crayon are habits that live in the hands. When she opened the library door and found Nicolás there, he did not look up. He was absorbed, his brow low, tongue near his teeth, tracing a little flock of numbers with a color that seemed picked for courage. Teresa's first impulse was practical. She placed a cup of hot chocolate on the table.
She hung his wet coat. She lowered the world's expectations to the level of the floor and offered warmth. Then she let herself look at the drawings. They were precise in a way that surprised her. Not neatness, but intent. Each number had a shape. Each sentence in his illustrated history had a face. The sums were arranged like nests. If you followed the bird to its branch, the answer arrived in the drawing, and not just in an empty box at the corner of an exam sheet. It was the work of a mind that thought in images, where meaning arrived as a scene, rather than a line of logic. Teresa, who had learned to read children for the terrain they were born into, saw an intelligence hiding behind behaviors others classified as failure. The house had seen many tutors come and go. Specialists with briefcases and polished shoes arrived, assessed, left their notes, furniture for the records. Don Esteban paid for their expertise in a currency of impatience. He wanted results. He wanted proof that the name Del Soler would continue, without the blemish of a son labeled behind. He spoke in a manner of strictness that was, more often than not, a way of protecting a hollow in his chest that the death of his wife had widened into a canyon. He was not cruel. He was precise. He demanded measures he could count. Teresa did not announce herself as a substitute for the tutors. She did not offer qualifications or promises. What she offered initially was quiet attention. She began to sit near Nicholas when he came to the library. She did not interrupt him. She did not ask why he scribbled one number in crimson and another in blue. She simply brought materials, scraps of paper, a spool of thread, a set of tiny wooden birds she had found in a market years ago. She set them down like small possible answers. The first lesson was not a lesson in the classical sense. It had no timetable, no curriculum. It was an experiment in trust. Teresa pointed to a page where Nicholas had drawn 3 nests on a branch, and, as if it were the most ordinary question in the world, quietly said, "If one bird sits in each nest, how many birds are there?" Nicholas's mouth tightened in the way of someone who had practiced confusion on demand. He counted with his fingers, hesitated, then looked at Teresa. He could conjure numbers as sounds on a page. He could not always find the route the school expected to map them. She did not push him toward the algebra he could not see. She brought the small wooden birds and placed them on the drawn nests. The birds were weighty in his palm. They made the problem real. He counted again, this time aloud, watching the birds as if they were performing a remedy. 3, he said. The word came like a small bell. "Show me," Teresa said. She did not correct him. She celebrated his way of understanding. She glued extra nests and extra birds. They made a little theater.
That day, something shifted. Not because Teresa taught him how to catch up, but because she offered a vocabulary that fit his mind. She translated the abstractions the academy demanded into the images he claimed as his own. Wordless things make loud music in a house like the del Soler's. Senora Valores felt the change as a disturbance of order. She had watched the boy with the same hawk's attention she used to check the linen. She had seen tutors at the table and their clean, bureaucratic notes, and she believed in the house's processes. A house like that lives by procedure. It is a mechanism of roles. When Teresa began to rearrange the way Nicolás asked the world for answers, Dolores felt the tremor of rules being rewritten. "She is only an employee," Dolores said once, though she did not say it to Teresa. She said it to the wallpaper, to the bowls lined up in the scullery where order meant control. If something goes wrong. But nothing went wrong that morning. Nicolás came back with a page he had not finished and a small victory clutched like contraband in his chest. He had lined numbers into a parade of birds and colored each beak with a different tone of hope. He would not show his father, not yet. He was tentative with his own triumphs. They had lured him into humility. Over weeks, their lessons multiplied in private ways. Teresa never called them lessons from a plan. She called them hours. She turned sums into flocks, fractions into halves of apples cut on paper plates, grammar into characters on a stage that Nicolás built with dolls. History came alive when she asked him to choreograph the fall of a city with paper soldiers. Science was a game of light and shadows projected onto the library wall. The method did not pretend to be revolutionary. It pretended to be empathetic. If Nicolás could walk through a concept in the way he walked through a garden, by sight and step, he could own it. The first palpable victory came on a day that felt like glass, a light that was both brittle and precise. Nicolás presented a school assignment to Don Esteban. It would have been a small thing, one of many papers he had brought home to be filed and stored as evidence of attendance. But this one had something different in its margins. The answer to a math problem written not as a number, but as a diagram. Don Esteban skimmed it with the calm impatience of a man who had learned to be unimpressed by paperwork. Then he stopped. "This is wrong," he said, though his voice had a softness that surprised even him. Teresa watched from the doorway, an invisible scene between two worlds. Don Esteban held the paper like a puzzled relic. He asked Nicolás to explain. The boy's face tightened with the old shame reflex, the sudden retreat. He looked at Teresa, and in that glance, something like permission arrived. He pushed the paper to her. She walked to the table and turned the page. She asked the boy to show her how he had thought of it.
He moved a finger along the diagram and spoke in the language he had been encouraged to use. "It is like the birds," Nicolás said. "See? The numbers are nests. If 2 nests are on one branch, you count the birds on the branch, not the boxes." Don Esteban listened. He listened because he was, despite everything, a man who prized outcomes. He wanted to know if a solution existed. When Teresa explained, not as an expert, but as a translator, showing how an abstract question could be turned into an image his son could own, Don Esteban felt something unfamiliar, a sliver of hope. He did not name it. Instead, he nodded, and for the first time in a long while, he watched his son's eyes sharpen. Hope met resistance. The academy had its forms. It had tutors with diplomas and a patience tailored to the school's language of metrics. 2 tutors had already tried to sculpt Nicolás into that language with the patience of men who measure success in charts. They had been kind, precise, ineffective. They left with recommendations that read like verdicts. The family quietly kept a list of professionals who had failed and a ledger of fees paid. In the house, gossip moved slower than dust, but it moved. Servants remark upon servants.
They exchange theories about why a child behaves as he does. They explain to one another to make the world manageable. Dolores circulated a narrative that Teresa was overstepping. It is one thing to mend sheets. It is another to rearrange a child's education. Maldición or no, a house is a house of boarders. Teresa understood the precariousness. Each hour she spent with Nicolás was a small risk. If discovered, she could be accused of interfering, of giving illicit help. But she had made a promise years before, to a woman whose handwriting trembled like a leaf. Laura Maria del Soler, Don Esteban's wife and Nicolás's mother, had once sat beside Teresa in the twilight of a hospital room and said with a voice like a thin thread, something Teresa kept in the hollow of her heart, "If anything of me remains in this house, let it be that a child was seen." Laura's letter would not reveal all her motives. Half the things we say in illness are attempts to manage the living. But Teresa held the sentiment as if it were a map. She had promised loyalty to that map rather than to the house's bureaucracy. If seeing a child required quiet disobedience, she would accept the consequences. The lessons continued. Nicolás learned to narrate the reasons behind his answers. He would hold a page like a stage and move pieces as if performing. At home, where expectations crawled like ivy, he began to speak in a voice that was not apologetic. He told jokes, then showed up with a sentence he had rehearsed for a father who had not known how to hear him. Don Esteban started to attend to the small theatrical displays with a professional's curiosity and a father's clumsy pride.
He would ask a question, and Nicolás would answer not with numbers alone, but with an image that led to numbers. Slowly, the father learned to follow a method created by patience. Not everyone in the house welcomed the change. Dolores's unease hardened into watchful surveillance. She began to take note of the little absences. Teresa coming in early, returning late, the small boxes of materials purchased with coins Teresa earned from mending linens. Dolores was practical. She feared the kind of scandal that upset schedules. "The academy will not tolerate irregular help," she warned one afternoon, as if reciting a lesson that had kept houses like theirs intact for generations. Teresa replied with the calm of someone who had learned the difference between policy and human need. "We are helping a child," she said. "There is nothing scandalous about that." Dolores's eyes narrowed. "And if the school says your method was not allowed, if they accuse you of giving answers?" She sounded as if reading a list of possible disasters. Her imagination was a ledger, too. "Then we will answer," Teresa said. Her voice had the clear ring of someone who had seen worse elsewhere. She did not think herself invincible. She thought herself necessary. Meanwhile, the academy's rhythms hummed on the other side of the house gate. The school published invitations, announcements, and lists of who would attend the National Academic Showcase, an event that gathered students from across the country for competitions in mathematics, language, and science. Parents attended in their best coats. Reporters took photographs of proud faces. For families, it was both a public proving ground and a vanity fair of grades. When the call came for Nicolás, an invitation wrapped in the academy's polite typography, it arrived like a stone dropped into a lake. It had been unexpected. Their household had not applied. Whoever had nominated him had done so quietly, citing a spark they had seen. The envelope lay on Don Esteban's desk, a small instrument that could bend the arc of whatever came next. He opened it with the kind of deliberate movement someone uses for fragile things. The letter asked the Del Soler family to confirm Nicolás's participation. It said the child's work had been recognized by an examiner who noticed unconventional thinking. The words were neutral, bureaucratic. They did not know the story of how those answers were prepared. They only saw results. To Don Esteban, the invitation was both vindication and a threat. It offered public proof that the name Del Soler still performed. It also opened a door to exposure. What if whoever evaluated Nicolás decided his methods were improper? What if the house was shamed for the invisible hands that guided the child? Within a day, the house divided into currents. Don Esteban wanted the boy to go. He felt a father's need to see his son rise above his problems, and a public man's need to have his family unblemished.
Dolores feared the boomerang of notoriety. Teresa felt a different pressure, a maternal fear that the effort to let a child be seen could become the reason the child was punished. For the boy, the invitation meant change. He did not understand adult politics. He saw only that some people wanted him to stand in a hall and perform. The prospect sparked both pride and fear. He practiced at home with Teresa, turning problems into small poems and pictures. They rehearsed the way a piece would be presented on stage, the route that would let him translate the academy's language into his own. "Will they let me bring my birds?" he asked one night, clutching a paper where a sum had turned into a flock. "If you show what you know," Teresa said, "they must see it." The decision was a hinge. Don Esteban signed the confirmation, balancing the risk as he balanced everything. He measured outcomes, anticipated consequences, then chose. He did not know that in doing so, he had already started a transformation he did not yet recognize. He could not yet see that when the house's invisible worker, Teresa, lent Nicolás a way to speak, she was also teaching a deeper lesson, that talent can hide beneath the neatness of privilege, waiting not for money, but for someone to find the right language. After the letter, the house buzzed with a new kind of preparation. Tutors returned with notebooks and solemn faces. Teresa and Nicolás retreated to the library. They rehearsed a presentation that had both the simplicity of a child's performance and the complexity of a translator's craft. They practiced without theatrics. Teresa refused to make the child into a spectacle. She wanted him steady, not sensational. The boy learned to anchor himself by touching the page he had drawn from, as if the paper hummed like a ground. At night, Nicolás dreamed of a stadium and crayon birds flying under floodlights. He woke with his cheeks damped and his hands clutching patterns that had matured overnight. The city seemed different now, less a metropolis of obligations, and more a net ready to catch him if he fell. He was readying not only answers, but a voice. Señora Dolores watched this with a face like a shutter closing. She did not enjoy the idea of a servant pulling the strings of a contest. She would not say the words aloud, but she feared the house being at the center of a scandal that would involve the academy, the press, and worst of all, Don Esteban's reputation. Her work was to protect the house from the messy intrusions of the outside world, anything that threatened the order of linens, the quiet of the library, the smooth operation of day-to-day rituals. "Keep it small," she told Teresa in the pantry, where their conversations were private and practical. "If you are seen too much with him, people will ask questions."
Teresa met her gaze, and in that look lay a history. Years of teaching children who had been left to the edges. Months of promises made to a woman who had asked for mercy for a child she loved. She did not answer with a list of rightness. She answered with a simple sentence, clear as a bell. "I will do what is best for him." Dolores went back to her ironing, her hands smoothing fabric, smoothing the world into something manageable. Her worry was a slow thing. It would not vanish easily. Weeks passed like rehearsals. The house learned a new choreography. Quiet mornings in the library, practiced presentations, a father's evenings now given over to attentive questions. On a rain-soft morning, the school sent a second letter. Nicolás had advanced to the regional stage, and his work would be presented in a gymnasium filled with judges, teachers, and parents. The invitation was more formal now. Photographers might attend. The academy might record his name. The stakes had shifted from private hope to public proof. Teresa held the second letter in both hands. Her palms smelled of soap and the faint dust of chalk. She did not say much. She had always known that the risk of being discovered would grow with success. Yet there was a thrill in that danger, a recognition that their small experiments had become something visible. For Teresa, visibility meant the possibility of changing not only the course of one child's life, but the idea of learning itself. "Are you afraid?" Nicolás asked her, sitting on the floor surrounded by his birds. "I am," she admitted. "But sometimes we have to be brave, because being brave helps others be brave too." He nodded, as if understanding a mathematical proof. He began to practice with a steadiness that surprised Teresa. He would stand in the library and perform the piece they had worked on, moving wooden birds and pointing to maps, speaking his answers with the clarity of a boy who had been given a vocabulary that matched his mind. Teresa knew the moment they would be tested was approaching. She also knew there were limits to what she could do. She was not a magician. She had no certificates to wave at the academy committee. What she possessed was attention and an uncanny knack for finding metaphors that fit how Nicolás thought. That, more than anything, would be their defense if the world asked them to explain. The night before the trip to the gymnasium, the house hummed with a quiet anxiety. Don Esteban adjusted his tie like a man fastening an armor. He unfolded every contingency he could imagine. Dolores double-checked the schedule, as if the right order of events could armor them all against embarrassment. Teresa, meanwhile, sat with Nicolás on the library floor,
and placed a small folded paper in his hand. Inside was a drawing Laura had once made, a simple sketch of a child with a cape. The pen strokes were careful and loving. "Your mother believed in you," Teresa said softly, and she did not have to say more.
The paper was a small vessel of memory, passed secretly between two women who had loved the same child in different ways. Nicolás traced the lines. He felt for a moment both the absence of the mother and the presence of the witness who had made him visible from afar. In the morning, the car took them across town to the gymnasium. The building smelled of varnish and public expectation. Families arrived in groups, folding chairs clicked into place, and the air carried the nervousness of children in uniforms. Nicolás gripped Teresa's hand for a second, then let go. Something in that grip changed the scale of duty for Teresa. She was no longer only a helper in the house. She was a guardian of a small, fragile thing, now traveling through the public world. They were scheduled in the afternoon. Nicolás presented with a calm that surprised even his own father. He laid out his drawings, moved his birds, recited the way numbers nested in branches. Judges listened with brows furrowed. Some made notes, others watched with the clinical curiosity of professionals who had seen many ways of being smart. It was when the crowd saw that his methods were not the usual script that the noise began. People instinctively categorize what they do not understand. Some leaned forward with interest, others whispered behind hands. A tutor from another school raised an eyebrow. A journalist scribbled quickly. Someone in the crowd, perhaps suspicious of the unusual assistance, noticed Teresa's presence and her connection to the boy. That detail would become the wedge. For now, in the gymnasium's half-light, Nicolás finished his piece. He did not need Teresa to speak for him. He put his hand to his chest and said quietly but clearly, "Everything I answered came from here." He tapped the space over his heart, a small, decisive gesture. The judges nodded, some impressed, some skeptical. They asked questions. He answered. He looked to Teresa once, seeking perhaps the permission to trust his own voice. He received it in the form of a smile that said nothing and everything. When they left the building, the sun had gone low, and the city felt like a book about to close. They returned home in a car heavy with the day's load. The house, as if sensing a plot shift, took in the shapes of its inhabitants and rearranged them with the slow work of servants and silence. That evening the phone calls came. Don Esteban answered with the cautious tone of someone checking a fragile vase for cracks. He put the receiver down and looked at Teresa with an expression she couldn't read. She braced herself. Dolores' suspicion, once a smolder, now had a possibility of flame. The house hummed with small noises, footsteps, the night clock, the soft rustle of papers. Outside, the city exhaled. Teresa went to bed with a mind that made lists, tasks they had completed, mistakes they had avoided, a gratitude that sat beside a dread. She had kept her promise to Laura by seeing a child. She had not yet paid the cost of being visible. Costs, she knew, sometimes arrive as inquiries. The next morning, sunlight struck the marble with a neutral brilliance, as if nothing was about to happen. Yet inside the house, the calm was fragile. Dolores had been awake early, running her own inventory of hazards. She had seen the headlines on a colleague's phone, a short item about unusual methods catching attention at the regionals. A neighbor had texted, asking in the delicate way neighbors ask when they hope for gossip. The seeds of attention had landed and begun to sprout. Teresa made tea. She stood at the kitchen sink and watched her hands move, ordinary as any. She thought of Laura's letter again, the paper she had folded into Nicholas's small fist. She thought of promises and of the quiet courage that seemed, in her experience, less like a roar and more like a persistent knocking at a closed door. A knock came at the front door before noon. Teresa knew, in the particular language of details, that this would be a day of questions. She dried her hands and walked to meet it. Outside,
An academy representative stood with a clipboard and a face practiced in neutrality. Behind him, a small camera crew, just one inconspicuous, waited as if the house were a stage. "Good morning," the man said, all business. "I'm from the Academy Committee. We've received an allegation that a candidate received unauthorized assistance during the regional presentation. We would like to ask a few questions." Teresa's breath shortened. Dolores, who had been within earshot like a plate waiting to be filled, stiffened in a way Teresa's years in service taught her to read as alarm. She could step back into the well-ordered world the house demanded. She could hide until the storm passed. Or she could answer. The promise she had made to a woman in a hospital years ago had become an instruction. If anything of Laura remained, let it be that the child was seen. Teresa opened the door wider and invited them in. The house, which had once hummed with the easy hierarchies of servants and masters, now held a new element, the possibility that a servant could be central to a public narrative. The day tilted, not yet a fall, but enough to let wind through. If moments are doors, then Teresa had just placed her hand on the knob. She felt it warm under her palm. Teresa opened the door wider as if setting a stage on which she had already decided to stand. The academy man stepped in with his clipboard like a judge with a measuring stick. The camera, small, unthreatening, hung at the shoulder of a technician who looked as if he had been handed better days. Dolores hovered nearby, an iron board of suspicion tucked under her arm. The library's white marble breathed cold around them. The crayons on the floor seemed suddenly very vulnerable. "Thank you for receiving us," the man said. His voice was the neutral voice of institutions, smooth, practiced, and slightly detached.
We must ask whether Nicolás del Soler received help that could be considered unauthorized during the regional presentation. That simple bureaucratic sentence was a rope thrown across the quiet of the house. Teresa felt it graze her ribs, but she did not flinch. She had prepared, in a way, for the knock that promised to split open the room where she had been careful with a child's learning. "We taught him to speak in pictures," Teresa said simply. Her hands, small and work-marked, folded around each other as if clasping the edges of the claim into a shape that would not topple. "A method?" the man asked, pen hovering. "An organized program? Materials brought into the contest?" Teresa could have chosen to hide the wooden birds, the small parcels of paper they had rehearsed with. She could have invented a neutral term, support, that would soothe the room of officials. Instead, she answered with the truth as she had always guarded it. "We translated questions into images that made sense to him. I did not give him answers. I showed him how to find them in his way." The man wrote, unblinking, "We will need to verify. An allegation of unauthorized assistance can affect the contest's integrity. There will be a formal inquiry." Dolores, who had sharpened every complaint into a plan since breakfast, suddenly found her voice strong with the language of household preservation. "You will also speak to Don Esteban. He will be disturbed to find the house under scrutiny," she said, as if that admission would tilt the balance back toward order. The academy man nodded. "We will request an interview. Also," he glanced at the camera, then at the library. "Evidence, if any." Teresa's throat tightened around a memory of small hands, of Laura's folded sketch. Evidence could be many things. It could be newspapers, it could be notes. It could be a child's ownership of a method that the world did not yet know how to name. They left an appointment card, a date, a time, a place whose walls would be less forgiving than the house's worn wood. The man walked away with the neutrality of an institution and the momentum of process. The camera followed like a quiet second thought. For the rest of the day, the house seemed a drumbeat of waiting. The servants moved in precise arcs so that silence would not become rumor. Don Esteban arrived home that evening to a table polished but taut, to a son who bore the fatigue of public performance like a cloak. He carried the newspaper folded over his arm, an innocuous man who held small storms in his pocket. When he closed the door, he found on his desk a letter whose envelope had been slipped under a blotter with the kind of punctuality that suggested both secrecy and ceremony. It was from the academy summoning them for an inquiry. Beside it, on the blotter, was another paper, the small drawing Teresa had given Nicolás the night before, Laura's careful lines.
Don Esteban's fingers hovered over it with something like a reflex. After grief, he had reduced most things to motion, a way to keep solidity in a world that offered none. He read the academy's note. Then he sat. The chair carried him as if it had expected him to land.
He traced the corner of Laura's sketch with a thumb he had not used in years for tenderness. For a moment, he felt like the house itself, beautiful on the surface, fragile inside its structure. "Who answered?" he asked, and his voice carried the soft accusation of a man asking whether an old wound had been exposed by a careless hand. Teresa, called to the drawing room as part of the household's choreography, stood in the shadow of the doorway. She could have retreated. Instead, she came forward. It was Nicolás's work. He used what we practiced. Don Esteban listened with the precision of a man who catalogued risk. "You know the Academy does not accept external assistance," he said. His words folded rules into the room, a kind of gravity that made things settle or shatter. If the committee finds irregularities, it could mean sanctions, not just for the contest, but reputations. Teresa looked him in the eye. She had seen his grief wear itself into a method of control. She had watched him equate order with safety. Her next sentence carried no accusation. It carried only a fact she had held close as if it were a small lamp. He learned. He spoke for himself. The agreement in Don Esteban's face had been partial until then, a measure of curiosity more than conviction. In the following days, the house moved toward the appointed day like a tide. Dolores ordered linens with mechanical deliberation. Tutors returned with material and stern, sympathetic faces. The city outside folded itself neat as curtains for an audience about to be seated. When the day arrived, the Academy's hall was stern. Pale walls, long tables, a panel of 3 judges whose expressions had the economy of people used to admonishing mistakes. The room smelled of coffee and the kind of paper that keeps decisions from being personal. A small crowd had gathered: parents, an incredulous journalist, a delegate from the Academy, the camera that had visited the house. Teresa and Nicolás entered together. He wore his school blazer like an armor he was still learning to inhabit. She walked beside him not as an official, but as the woman who had watched the way his fingers curled around solutions until they grew a shell of certainty. Dolores sat behind them, her hands folded as if committing to prayer she did not believe in. The committee began with the facts. A representative recounted that an allegation had been raised, that unauthorized assistance had been provided at the regional presentation. Someone in the gymnasium had noticed Teresa with Nicolás and interpreted presence as advantage. The committee had called them to explain.
Teresa explained calmly how she had recognized a child who thought in images and how she had built bridges for him. She described, in detail that bore the cleanliness of someone explaining how to mend a seam, the wooden birds, the paper soldiers, the shadows on the wall. She refused to make her teaching into a spectacle for the room. She described it as she had always done, small acts of translation. "Did you give him answers?" the chair of the committee asked finally, and the question was the one that could cleave them. "No," Teresa said. "I taught him how to see the problem in a way that made sense to him." Some on the panel nodded. Teachers among judges will hear teaching. Others squinted, thinking in measures and fairness. "Can you demonstrate here with an unseen test?" another asked. "If the boy can solve new problems using his method, perhaps we can determine if his capacity is independent of assistance." It was a request that balanced on the edge between curiosity and interrogation. Teresa looked at Nicolás. He had been told he would not be turned into a performance. Yet the committee's request was not a prosecution so much as a chance to show the world the shape of his mind. He considered his wooden birds packed away in his bag, small, secret saints of proof, and then he nodded. They set him a problem that had not been practiced, an arrangement of numbers abstract enough to require translation. His hands smoothed the paper, and for a second his face was a map of concentration so intense it seemed to alter the light around him. He moved his finger as he had rehearsed, as if walking a path he had found by himself. Then he reached into a small satchel and pulled out a piece of folded paper, his own sketch, the way he had taught himself to keep answers in a place that felt like truth. He laid birds and nests on the table, quietly, as if setting a meal. The judges watched with the clinical interest of professionals who study attempts to understand what intelligence can look like. The journalists scribbled. Dolores leaned forward, an expression she had not allowed herself to wear in public, an almost astonishment that might be the first crack of softness. When the boy completed the test, when the birds had a place and the tally sounded right, the room exhaled, like a body letting go of something held too long.
One judge said almost to himself, "He is solving it." Another added, "In his way." That phrase felt like both a verdict and a truth. Yet the moment the committee's chairs softened, a voice from the back of the room rose, a voice threaded with the certainty of those who police fairness. "If there was any coaching," the voice said, "it should be considered. The rules are clear." That was the hinge. The narrative swung into its darker orbit. The academy could accept a child's different mind, or it could put process before person. Teresa, who had never sought accolades, felt the weight of containment press into her.
It was then that Nicolás did what Teresa had hoped he would do in private, but feared they would never allow him to do in public. He stood, and with the small dignity of a child who had recently learned the syntax of his own mind, he placed his hand over his chest and spoke, quietly, to the people in that courtroom, who spoke as if the world could be measured on clipboards. "Everything I answered came from here," he said. He tapped the space over his heart. "She showed me how to see it." The chamber turned. The chair of the committee, a woman whose life had been a series of measured decisions, sat very still. For a moment, the length of a held breath, what counted as evidence, shifted. It was no longer only about who had been present. It was about whether a child could call his answers his own. The committee recessed to deliberate. The room hummed with private conjectures, some in favor, some anxious to imagine how precedent might be shaped. Teresa sat in the gallery as if a visitor, but Dolores, who had watched everything with a hard, practical eye, placed a hand on Teresa's shoulder. It was the first public human touch Dolores had offered since suspicion had hardened into action. The touch was small and equivalent to an apology. It was more than Teresa had expected and less than she might have wanted, but it mattered. Outside, the press smelled victory. They wrote 2 narratives, one about a talented child who thought differently, and another about a servant who might have crossed a line. The public loves a binary. The truth exists in the space between headlines. Don Esteban had not been present at the hearing. He arrived later to collect the household and found the house quieter than its worn rhythm. He walked into the library where Teresa sat, the afternoon light making a forgiving color on her hair. On the desk lay a small envelope, its paper worn in a way that suggested it had been handled with reverence. He took it up because old grief is sometimes answered by the movement of hands. Inside, he found Laura's letter, folded small like a secret. The lines trembled with the voice of the woman he had loved and then lost. Laura's handwriting was exact and intimate. She had written of small things, of the hope that a child be seen rather than coerced into a measure that fits someone else's scale. She had written Teresa's name and entrusted to her a fragment of desire, that someone might witness their son fully. Don Esteban read at his face, which had become a landscape of management, softened like a winter thaw. He had been strict because the world had become dangerous, and his way of keeping danger away was through control. Laura's note was a reprimand in love. It invited him to let someone else manage a different kind of care. When he found Teresa in the library, he did not accuse. Instead, he folded the letter and placed it on the desk between them. "She asked you to watch him," he said simply. "I did not listen well."
The admission was a small dismantling of pride. Don Esteban is not a man who confesses quickly. That it was his grief, not his disgust, that had made him strict, was a realization that took him longer to name than any institutional reprimand could force. He had been arranging his son's life into safe boxes because he did not know how to repair himself. Now, faced with Laura's handwriting, he felt the edges of a different duty, to acknowledge how their son had been made visible by someone the world called just an employee. This might look like scandal, Teresa said, aware that the house still contained people whose loyalty was anchored in the old rules. But he learned. Don Esteban looked at Nicolás's sketches scattered along the table and saw not only a method, but the boy's small emerging authority. He had always believed that wealth could buy safety, but it could not buy being seen. Laura had left a whisper in a letter that Teresa had followed and that the boy had turned into voice. "I will go to the committee," Don Esteban said. The sentence was small but comprehensive. He would not hide them. He would not let the house be the stage for shame. He would place his weight where it had always been absent, in recognition. At the committee's final session, with the city's afternoon light squeezed through narrow windows, Don Esteban sat not as a man defending his name, but as a father claiming his son's right to be understood. He spoke with the collected calm of someone who had catalogued consequences, but now wanted a different ledger. He confirmed that Teresa had been an employee of the household, and that she had taught Nicolás in the ways she described. He read aloud a note he had found, Laura's lines folded into memory, asking that her son be seen. The committee listened. Their deliberation took on the weight of a small verdict. They recognized that an ethics question had many faces: fairness to competitors, the sanctity of rules, and the child's right to his method of understanding. The Academy could have chosen to punish, a choice that would have been meet and public. Instead, it chose to test its own contours. "What we saw," said the chair of the committee finally, "is a child demonstrating competencies in his own idiom. We must not mistake difference for foul play. However, we also must ensure fairness at contests. Therefore, we will clarify our rules to include methods that do not involve direct answer-giving. We will invite Teresa Morales to submit her approach for review and consideration as an acceptable adaptation." It was not a triumph as headlines define triumphs. It was messy. It was process. It was, in its way, a doorway. The committee validated Nicolás's answers and made a small institutional allowance. The Academy would begin to consider different forms of expression as legitimate evidence of understanding. Teresa's actions were not branded illegal. Instead, they became the spark for a conversation about how the Academy measures knowledge. The house exhaled the night the committee announced their findings. Dolores moved as if the world had sorted itself along a slightly gentler axis. She did not sing Teresa's praises, but she began asking practical questions about materials and schedules, small acts that signal a person preparing to include rather than exclude. For Teresa, the moment felt like a dizzying relief and the beginning of a new responsibility. The things she'd done quietly in the library had become public, and with that public came new choices. Then came an unexpected letter from the Academy, not a reprimand, but an offer. They asked Teresa to consider formal collaboration, an invitation to design accessible teaching adaptations, to work with a pilot program that would study how children who think differently can show what they know. It was not a job at first, it was an invitation to be part of a team. For Teresa, who had given up formal titles long ago to care for the practical needs of a household, the invitation felt like both validation and a summons. Don Esteban, who had sat through the committee's meeting with the uneasy stillness of a man who had been forced into introspection, approached Teresa privately and placed an envelope in her hands. It contained a letter of employment, drafted by the family's advisors, an offer of formal hiring, with fair wages and clear responsibilities, to make Teresa not merely an invisible helper, but an acknowledged educator in Nicolás's life, and potentially in a wider program the family wished to support. "You must be cautious," Dolores said, not as a threat, but as a warning that came from someone who had learned the house's rules. "It is already dangerous," Teresa replied, but this time her voice carried a steadiness shaped by years of having seen worse and choosing nonetheless to act. "We will choose how dangerous." The next months unfurled like a new chapter of careful work. Teresa began collaborating with teachers at the Academy, translating her intuitions into language that could be examined and refined. She did not accept that her experience was the only way forward. She collaborated. She gathered other teachers, parents, and children, and watched how visual strategies helped in certain contexts, not as a cure for everything, but as an honest option for those who needed it. The Academy convened panels. Papers were drafted. A pilot program formed. Change moved as it often does, slowly, with resistance, then with small, persistent acceptances. In the Del Soler house, things shifted in small ways that mattered. Nicolás's desk was placed near a window to let in light for his drawings. Teresa's schedule was formalized, so that her work would not be a secret, but part of the family's recognized duties.
Don Esteban joined in small rituals. He substituted afternoons for the kinds of questions he had once deferred. He learned to ask his son how the birds in his diagrams decided to alight where they did. Each exchange made the father's grief a little less like armor and a little more like a language he could use to be present.
Dolores, who had feared scandal, began to appreciate the practicalities of inclusion. She saw that when the boy was less anxious, the house ran smoother. She did not convert into a cheerful advocate, but she brought extra linens to Teresa's small classes, and once quietly delivered a tray of pastries without comment, an offering of truce. Then came the moment public attention broadened, an invitation to an educational conference, modest at first, then larger, to speak about adaptations and the idea that varied forms of intelligence deserve formal recognition. The story of a child in a mansion and an employee with a gift had become a narrative that could carry a lesson beyond the house. Teresa was invited to present a case study. Nicolás, now older by months that had grown into many small changes, was asked to appear as an example. 5 years later, the scene had rearranged itself into an auditorium whose wood had been worn by many feet and many ideas. The stage held Teresa, Nicolás, tall, confident, his hand sometimes finding, reflexively, the fold of paper that still made him steady, and Don Esteban beside them, less a man of distance than one who had learned to stand near. The audience included teachers from public schools, educators who had once scoffed, now curious, young parents with notebooks, policymakers seeking sense in an oft-confused educational landscape. Teresa spoke not as a prophet, but as a teacher who had watched the slow bloom of a child. She described the principles concise and human, attention, translation, and the humility to meet a student where they begin. She insisted that her work had not been a miracle, nor a guarantee. It was a practice, an invitation to listen and to build bridges between the forms the world asks and the forms a child offers. Nicolás took the mic with the kind of ease that comes from being rehearsed in truth. He wore clothes that signaled adolescence and a steadiness that indicated he had not lost the tenderness that had been built into him. He spoke of birds and nests, of numbers that arranged themselves into pictures, and with a clarity that made people lean forward, he reached to the place over his heart. "Different is not less," he said. "It's another path. Teresa didn't give me answers. She taught me how to find them in a way that is mine." The applause that followed was neither like the sharp sound of triumph nor like the polite patter of ordinary thank yous. It was the kind of recognition that comes when an audience realizes it has been shown a way to see. Don Esteban spoke last, his voice steady and careful. He told of grief and of the small ceremony of reading his wife's words years earlier, of the stubbornness that had kept him distant, and the gradual lesson of learning to witness rather than command. He spoke of the resource that wealth can provide when directed toward listening and trust, concluding with an invitation to direct funds and attention toward programs that would help teachers learn to translate, and for institutions to adapt rules that measure knowledge in multiple languages. The conference, modest as it began, seeded conversations in school boards, in teacher training courses, and in desks where children still sat hoping someone would notice them. A pilot program found its way into public schools, bringing Teresa's kind of adaptations to classrooms that had once measured only one kind of success. It was messy and incremental. It was, in other words, education. Back in the Del Soler house, the library that had once been a secret proving ground became a small center for workshops. Teachers came with notebooks, parents came with children who had been told until then that their differences were deficits. Dolores, who tended the house with the practical devotion of someone who believed order shaped possibility, now arranged the chairs for these gatherings and occasionally left a note for Teresa with a compliment that read like a recipe for goodwill. People often expect a simple moral to such stories, a clear line from struggle to victory. The truth is knottier. Teresa continued to make sacrifices, time away from other duties, emotional labor that rules cannot always remunerate. Don Esteban continued to work against his instincts to control. Dolores continued to watch for scandal, but they also learned to live with the imperfect, generous, and stubborn practice of paying attention to a child. The movement that began with a woman and a flock of wooden birds did not cure institutional inertia overnight. It did not declare a revolution, but it changed the conversation, among one house, then among one committee, then in a modest network of schools willing to listen. The measure of change was not only in policies drafted or articles printed, but in the quieter daily facts, a teacher who no longer dismissed a child's scribble, a parent who began to ask not that their child be fixed, but that their child be seen, a school that allowed a portfolio of pictures in addition to a test. Years later, when Nicholas returned to that gymnasium as a young advocate, he carried with him the memory of a wooden bird in his hand and the knowledge that his answers had always belonged to him. When he drew now, his pictures were larger, more confident. Sometimes he painted the same nests, but in a way that suggested entire neighborhoods could be counted differently. He spoke about policy less than about people. His words were small scaffolds for others to climb. Teresa never framed herself as a hero.
In public, she insisted that the real work belonged to many hands, teachers who experiment, parents who trust, institutions willing to bend. She accepted a formal position in a program that trained teachers in multimodal instruction. She still mended linen when needed. Humility was a habit she never shed. And sometimes she would find a child in a corner of the library and hand over a small wooden bird with a wink that said, silently, begin. In the end, what changed everything was not a single method or a headline, but a chain of small, brave acts. A mother's request folded into a letter, a house employee who remembered how to read a child's mind, a boy who learned to name his way of knowing, and a father who opened his hands enough to let others help him be a parent. The Academy's policy shifts were important, but they were not the story's heart. The heart was in the new permissions people gave one another. On a late afternoon, years after the first knock at the door, Teresa sat in the library with Nicolás and watched him lay out a tableau of his own making. The wooden birds were worn at the edges, like any object that had been loved into usefulness. A child in the doorway, a neighbor's son, watched with a shy fascination. Teresa offered him a seat. She gave him a scrap of paper and a small task, to make the numbers sing as pictures. The boy's eyes lit. Teresa smiled as if the work itself were a prayer she had been permitted to answer. When people asked Nicolás what he had learned that mattered most, he would say simply that I was allowed to be myself. He would add, when pressed by adults who wanted policies and plans, that what made a difference was someone who refused to name him by what he failed to be, and instead learned the language he already had. And perhaps the truest change, one that quietly moved from the Del Soler house to other houses, to school staff rooms and municipal meetings, was the willingness to tolerate slight disorder for a child's sake, letting a child's desk be cluttered with pictures, accepting that a test might be a drawing, allowing a house employee to be the one who sees what no one else has seen. The motto that began to attach itself to their work was not a slogan so much as a compass. Different is not less, it's another path. It traveled easily by word of mouth, in teacher circles, and quiet emails between parents, in a conference program where someone had the courage to put it on the last page. If this story reached you, if it sits like a small weight in your chest and makes you think of a child at a kitchen table, or of a teacher who once changed something for you, then share it. Share it with a teacher, a parent, or a child who needs to hear that being different is its own kind of map. The change we want begins when someone says, simply, I will look.
And so, the mansion that once held a boy who felt small now contains a small truth, that wealth and titles and polished surfaces matter less than the permission to be seen. Teresa continued to teach, Don Esteban continued to learn, and Nicolás continued to draw the world into ways he could live inside it. The Academy's hallways kept their rules, but gradually their forms grew roomier. The pilot programs multiplied carefully into policy conversations. A hobby of wooden birds grew into a conversation about how schools could make space for more kinds of thought. This is not an end. It is an invitation to look, to listen, to allow small acts of courage to seed larger changes. If you know a teacher who needs encouragement or a parent who worries a child is being misunderstood, send them this story. Give them the small permission Teresa gave Nicolás to be seen. Share this with someone who needs to hear that different is not less.